Chapter 3 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2. Paris and Prison. By Giacomo Casanova. Translated by Arthur Machen. Episode 6. Chapter 3. Henrietta receives the visit of Monsieur d'Antoine. I accompany her as far as Geneva, and then I lose her. I cross the St. Bernard, and return to Parma. A letter from Henrietta. My despair. De la Haye becomes attached to me. Unpleasant adventure with an actress, and its consequences. I turn a thorough bigot. Bavois. I mystify a bragging officer. As soon as I had reached our apartment, my heart bursting with anxiety, I repeated to Henrietta every word spoken by Monsieur d'Antoine, and delivered his letter, which contained 4 pages of writing. She read it attentively, with visible emotion, and then she said, "Dearest friend, do not be offended, but the honour of 2 families does not allow of my imparting to you the contents of this letter. I am compelled to receive Monsieur d'Antoine, who represents himself as being one of my relatives." "Ah!" I exclaimed, "this is the beginning of the end. What a dreadful thought! I am near the end of a felicity which was too great to last. Wretch that I have been! Why did I tarry so long in Parma? What fatal blindness! Of all the cities in the whole world, except France, Parma was the only one I had to fear, and it is here that I have brought you, when I could have taken you anywhere else, for you had no will but mine. I am the more guilty that you never concealed your fears from me. Why did I introduce that fatal Dubois here? Ought I not to have guessed that his curiosity would sooner or later prove injurious to us? And yet I cannot condemn that curiosity, for it is, alas, a natural feeling. I can only accuse all the perfections which Heaven has bestowed upon you, perfections which have caused my happiness, and which will plunge me into an abyss of despair, for, alas, I foresee a future of fearful misery. I entreat you, dearest, to foresee nothing, and to calm yourself. Let us avail ourselves of all our reason in order to prove ourselves superior to circumstances, whatever they may be. I cannot answer this letter, but you must write to Monsieur d'Antoine to call here tomorrow, and to send up his name. Alas! You compel me to perform a painful task. You are my best, my only friend. I demand nothing, I impose no task upon you. But can you refuse me? No, never, no matter what you ask. Dispose of me, I am yours in life and death. I knew what you would answer. You must be with me when Monsieur d'Antoine calls, but after a few minutes given to etiquette, will you find some pretext to go to your room and leave us alone? Monsieur d'Antoine knows all my history. He knows in what I have done wrong, and in what I have been right. As a man of honour, as my relative, he must shelter me from all affront. He will not do anything against my will, and if he attempts to deviate from the conditions I will dictate to him, I will refuse to go to France. I will follow you anywhere, and devote to you the remainder of my life. Yet, my darling, recollect that some fatal circumstances may compel us to consider our separation as the wisest course to adopt, that we must husband all our courage to adopt it, if necessary, and to endeavour not to be too unhappy. Have confidence in me, and be quite certain that I shall take care to reserve for myself the small portion of happiness which I can be allowed to enjoy without the man who alone has won all my devoted love. You will have, I trust, and I expect it from your generous soul, the same care of your future, and I feel certain that you must succeed. In the meantime, let us drive away all the sad forebodings which may darken the hours we have yet before us. Ah! Why did we not go away immediately, after we had met that accursed favourite of the Infante? We might have made matters much worse, for in that case Monsieur d'Antoine might have made up his mind to give my family a proof of his zeal by instituting a search to discover our place of residence. I should then have been exposed to violent proceedings which you would not have endured. It would have been fatal to both of us. I did everything she asked of me. From that moment our love became sad, and sadness is a disease which gives the death blow to affection. We would remain a whole hour opposite each other without exchanging a single word, and our sighs would be heard whatever we did to hush them. The next day M. d'Antoine called. I followed exactly the instructions she had given me, and for 6 mortal hours I remained alone, pretending to write. The door of my room was open, and a large looking-glass allowed us to see each other. They spent those 6 hours in writing, occasionally stopping to talk of I do not know what, but their conversation was evidently a decisive one. The reader can easily realize how much I suffered during that long torture, for I could expect nothing but the total wreck of my happiness. As soon as the terrible M. d'Antoine had taken leave of her, Henrietta came to me, and observing that her eyes were red, I heaved a deep sigh, but she tried to smile. "Shall we go away to-morrow, dearest?" "Oh, yes, I am ready. Where do you wish me to take you?" "Anywhere you like, but we must be here in a fortnight." "Here? Oh, fatal illusion!" "Alas, it is so. I have promised to be here to receive the answer to a letter I have just written. We have no violent proceedings to fear, but I cannot bear to remain in Parma. Ah, I curse the hour which brought us to this city. Would you like to go to Milan?" "Yes." "As we are unfortunately compelled to come back, we might as well take with us Caudagna and his sister." "As you please." "Let me arrange everything. I will order a carriage for them, and they will take charge of your violoncello. Do you not think that you ought to let M. d'Antoine know where you are going?" "No, it seems to me, on the contrary, that I need not account to him for any of my proceedings. So much the worse for him if he should, even for one moment, doubt my word." The next morning we left Parma, taking only what we wanted for an absence of a fortnight. We arrived in Milan without accident, but both very sad, and spent the following 15 days in constant tete-a-tete, without speaking to anyone except the landlord of the hotel and to a dressmaker. I presented my lovely Henrietta with a magnificent pelisse made of lynx fur, a present which she prized highly. Out of delicacy she never enquired about my means, and I felt grateful to her for that reserve. I was very careful to conceal from her the fact that my purse was getting very light. When we came back to Parma I had only 300 or 400 sequins. A day after our return M. d'Antoine invited himself to dine with us, and after we had drunk coffee I left him alone with Henrietta. Their interview was as long as the first, and our separation was decided. She informed me of it immediately after the departure of M. d'Antoine, and for a long time we remained folded in each other's arms, silent and blending our bitter tears. "When shall I have to part from you, my beloved? Alas! Too much, beloved one." "Be calm, dearest. Only when we reach Geneva, whither you are going to accompany me. Will you try to find me a respectable maid by tomorrow? She will accompany me from Geneva to the place where I am bound to go." "Oh, then we shall spend a few more days together. I know no one but Dubois whom I would trust to procure a good femme de chambre. Only I do not want him to learn from her what you might not wish him to know." "That will not be the case, for I will take another maid as soon as I am in France." 3 days afterward, Dubois, who had gladly undertaken the commission, presented to Henrietta a woman already somewhat advanced in years, pretty well dressed and respectable looking, who, being poor, was glad of an opportunity of going back to France, her native country. Her husband, an old military officer, had died a few months before, leaving her totally unprovided for. Henrietta engaged her, and I told her to keep herself ready to start whenever M. Dubois should give her notice. The day before the one fixed for our departure, M. d'Antoine dined with us, and before taking leave of us he gave Henrietta a sealed letter for Geneva. We left Parma late in the evening, and stopped only 2 hours in Turin, in order to engage a manservant whose services we required as far as Geneva. The next day we ascended Mont Cenis in sedan chairs, and we descended to the Novalaise in mountain sledges. On the 5th day we reached Geneva, and we put up at the Hotel des Balances. The next morning Henrietta gave me a letter for the banker Tronchin, who, when he had read it, told me that he would call himself at the hotel, and bring me 1,000 louis d'or. I came back, and we sat down to dinner. We had not finished our meal when the banker was announced. He had brought the 1,000 louis d'or, and told Henriette that he would give her 2 men whom he could recommend in every way. She answered that she would leave Geneva as soon as she had the carriage, which he was to provide for her, according to the letter I had delivered to him. He promised that everything would be ready for the following day, and he left us. It was indeed a terrible moment. Grief almost benumbed us both. We remained motionless, speechless, wrapped in the most profound despair. I broke that silence to tell her that the carriage which M. Tronchin would provide could not possibly be as comfortable and as safe as mine, and I entreated her to take it, assuring that by accepting it she would give me a last proof of her affection. "I will take in exchange, my dearest love, the carriage sent by the banker." "I accept the change, darling," she answered. "It will be a very great consolation to possess something which has belonged to you." As she said these words, she slipped in my pocket 5 rolls containing 100 louis d'or, a slight consolation for my heart, which was almost broken by our cruel separation. During the last 24 hours we could boast of no other eloquence but that which finds expression in tears, in sobs, and in those hackneyed but energetic exclamations which 2 happy lovers are sure to address to reason, when in its sternness it compels them to part from one another in the very height of their felicity. Henriette did not endeavour to lure me with any hope for the future, in order to allay my sorrow. Far from that, she said to me, "Once we are parted by fate, my best and only friend, never inquire after me, and, should chance throw you in my way, do not appear to know me." She had given me a letter from M. d'Antoine, without asking me whether I intended to go back to Parma, but, even if such had not been my intention, I should have determined at once upon returning to that city. She likewise entreated me not to leave Geneva until I had received a letter which she promised to write me from the first stage of her journey. She started at daybreak, having with her a maid, a footman on the box of the carriage, and being preceded by a courier on horseback. I followed her with my eyes as long as I could see her carriage, and I was standing on the same spot long after my eyes had lost sight of it. All my thoughts were wrapped up in the beloved object I had lost for ever. The world was a blank. I went back to my room, ordered the waiter not to disturb me until the return of the horses which had drawn Henriette's carriage, and I lay down on my bed in the hope that sleep would for a time silence a grief which tears could not drown. The postilion which had driven Henriette did not return till the next day. He had gone as far as Chatillon. He brought me a letter in which I found one single word, "Adieu." He told me that they had reached Chatillon without accident, and that the lady had immediately continued her journey towards Lyons. As I could not leave Geneva until the following day, I spent alone in my room some of the most melancholy hours of my life. I saw on one of the panes of glass of a window these words which she had traced with the point of a diamond I had given her: "You will forget Henriette." That prophecy was not likely to afford me any consolation, but had she attached its full meaning to the word "forget"? No, she could only mean that time would at last heal the deep wounds of my heart, and she ought not to have made it deeper by leaving behind her those words which sounded like a reproach. No, I have not forgotten her, for even now, when my head is covered with white hair, the recollection of her is still a source of happiness for my heart. When I think that, in my old age, I derive happiness only from the recollections of the past, I find that my long life must have counted more bright than dark days, and offering my thanks to God, the giver of all, I congratulate myself and confess that life is a great blessing. The next day I set off again for Italy, with a servant recommended by M. Tronchin, and although the season was not favourable, I took the road over Mont Saint Bernard, which I crossed in 3 days, with 7 mules carrying me, my servant, my luggage, and the carriage sent by the banker, to the beloved woman now ever lost to me. One of the advantages of a great sorrow is that nothing else seems painful. It is a sort of despair which is not without some sweetness. During that journey I never felt either hunger or thirst, or the cold which is so intense in that part of the Alps that the whole of nature seems to turn to ice, or the fatigue inseparable from such a dangerous and difficult journey. I arrived in Parma in pretty good health, and took up my quarters at a small inn, in the hope that in such a place I should not meet any acquaintance of mine. But I was disappointed, for I found in that inn M. de la Haye, who had a room next to mine. Surprised at seeing me, he paid me a long compliment, trying to make me speak, but I eluded his curiosity by telling him that I was tired, and that we would see each other again. On the following day I called upon M. d'Antoine, and delivered the letter which Henriette had written to him. He opened it in my presence, and finding another to my address enclosed in his, he handed it to me without reading it, although it was not sealed. Thinking, however, that it might have been Henriette's intention that he should read it before it was opened, he asked my permission to do so, which I granted with pleasure as soon as I had myself perused it. He handed it back to me after he had read it, telling me very feelingly that I could in everything rely upon him, and upon his influence and credit. Here is Henriette's letter. It is I, dearest and best friend, who have been compelled to abandon you, but do not let your grief be increased by any thought of my sorrow. Let us be wise enough to suppose that we have had a happy dream, and not to complain of destiny, for never did so beautiful a dream last so long. Let us be proud of the consciousness that for 3 months we gave one another the most perfect felicity. Few human beings can boast so much. Let us swear never to forget one another, and to often remember the happy hours of our love, in order to renew them in our souls, which, although divided, will enjoy them as acutely as if our hearts were beating one against the other. Do not make any inquiries about me, and if by chance let you know who I am, forget it for ever. I feel certain that you will be glad to hear that I have arranged my affairs so well that I shall, for the remainder of my life, be happy as I can possibly be without you, dear friend, by my side. I do not know who you are, but I am certain that no one in the world knows you better than I do. I shall not have another lover as long as I live, but I do not wish you to imitate me. On the contrary, I hope that you will love again, and I trust that a good fairy will bring you along your path another Henriette. Farewell, farewell. I met that adorable woman 15 years later. The reader will see where and how, when we come to that period of my life. I went back to my room, careless of the future, broken down by the deepest of sorrows. I locked myself in, and went to bed. I felt so low in spirits that I was stunned. Life was not a burden, but only because I did not give a thought to life. In fact, I was in a state of complete apathy, moral and physical. 6 years later I found myself in a similar predicament, but that time love was not the cause of my sorrow. It was the horrible and too famous prison of the Leads in Venice. I was not much better either in 1768, when I was lodged in the prison of Buen Retiro in Madrid, but I must not anticipate events. At the end of 24 hours my exhaustion was very great, but I did not find the sensation disagreeable, and in the state of mind in which I was then, I was pleased with the idea that, by increasing, that weakness would at last kill me. I was delighted to see that no one disturbed me to offer some food, and I congratulated myself upon having dismissed my servant. 24 more hours passed by, and my weakness became complete inanition. I was in that state when De la Haye knocked at my door. I would not have answered it if he had not said that someone insisted upon seeing me. I got out of bed, and scarcely able to stand, I opened my door, after which I got into bed again. "There is a stranger here," he said, "who, being in want of a carriage, offers to buy yours." "I do not want to sell it." "Excuse me if I have disturbed you, but you look ill." "Yes, I wish to be left alone." "What is the matter with you?" Coming nearer to my bed, he took my hand and found my pulse extremely low and weak. "What did you eat yesterday?" "I have eaten nothing, thank God, for 2 days." Guessing the real state of things, De la Haye became anxious. and entreated me to take some broth. He threw so much kindness, so much unction into his entreaties, that, through weakness and weariness, I allowed myself to be persuaded. Then, without ever mentioning the name of Henrietta, he treated me to a sermon upon the life to come, upon the vanity of the things of this life which we are foolish enough to prefer, and upon the necessity of respecting our existence, which does not belong to us. I was listening without answering one word, but, after all, I was listening, and De la Haye, perceiving his advantage, would not leave me, and ordered dinner. I had neither the will nor the strength to resist, and when the dinner was served I ate something. Then De la Haye saw that he had conquered, and for the remainder of the day devoted himself to amusing me by his cheerful conversation. The next day the tables were turned, for it was I who invited him to keep me company and to dine with me. It seemed to me that I had not lost a particle of my sadness, but life appeared to me once more preferable to death, and thinking that I was indebted to him for the preservation of my life, I made a great friend of him. My readers will presently see that my affection for him went very far, and they will, like me, marvel at the cause of that friendship, and at the means through which it was brought about. 3 or 4 days afterwards, Dubois, who had been informed of everything by De la Haye, called on me, and persuaded me to go out. I went to the theatre, where I made the acquaintance of several Corsican officers who had served in France in the Royal Italian Regiment. I also met a young man from Sicily, named Paterno, the wildest and most heedless fellow it was possible to see. He was in love with an actress who made a fool of him. He amused me with the enumeration of all her adorable qualities, and of all the cruelties she was practising upon him, for, although she received him at all hours, she repulsed him harshly whenever he tried to steal the slightest favour. In the meantime she ruined him by making him pay constantly for excellent dinners and suppers, which were eaten by her family, but which did not advance him 1 inch towards the fulfilment of his wishes. He succeeded at last in exciting my curiosity. I examined the actress on the stage, and finding that she was not without beauty, I expressed a wish to know her. Paterno was delighted to introduce me to her. I found that she was of tolerably easy virtue, and knowing that she was very far from rolling in riches, I had no doubt that 15 or 20 sequins would be quite sufficient to make her compliant. I communicated my thoughts to Paterno, but he laughed and told me that, if I dared to make such a proposition to her, she would certainly shut her door against me. He named several officers whom she had refused to receive again, because they had made similar offers. "Yet," added the young man, "I wish you would make the attempt, and tell me the results candidly." I felt piqued, and promised to do it. I paid her a visit in her dressing room at the theatre, and as she happened during our conversation to praise the beauty of my watch, I told her that she could obtain easy possession of it, and I said at what price. She answered, according to the catechism of her profession, that an honourable man had no right to make such an offer to a respectable girl. "I offer only 1 ducat," said I, "to those who are not respectable," and I left her. When I told Paterno what had occurred, he fairly jumped for joy, but I knew what to think of it all, for così sono tutte, and, in spite of all his entreaties, I declined to be present at his suppers, which were far from amusing, and gave the family of the actress an opportunity of laughing at the poor fool who was paying for them. 7 or 8 days afterwards, Paterno told me that the actress had related the affair to him exactly in the same words which I had used, and she added that, if I had ceased my visits, it is only because I was afraid of her taking me at my word in case I should renew my proposal. I commissioned him to tell her that I would pay her another visit, not to renew my offer, but to shew my contempt for any proposal that she might make me herself. The heedless fellow fulfilled his commission so well that the actress, feeling insulted, told him that she dared me to call upon her. Perfectly determined to shew that I despised her, I went to her dressing room the same evening, after the second act of a play in which she was not to appear again. She dismissed those who were with her, saying that she wanted to speak with me, and after she had bolted the door, she sat down gracefully on my knees, asking me whether it was true that I despised her so much. In such a position a man has not the courage to insult a woman, and instead of answering I set to work at once, without meeting even with that show of resistance which sharpens the appetite. In spite of that, dupe as I always was of a feeling truly absurd when an intelligent man has to deal with such creatures, I gave her 20 sequins, and I confess that it was paying dearly for very smarting regrets. We both laughed at the stupidity of Paterno, who did not seem to know how such challenges generally end. I saw the unlucky son of Sicily the next morning, and I told him, having found the actress very dull, I would not see her again. Such was truly my intention, but a very important reason, which nature took care to explain to me 3 days afterwards, compelled me to keep my word through a much more serious motive than a simple dislike for the woman. However, although I was deeply grieved to find myself in such a disgraceful position, I did not think that I had any right to complain. On the contrary, I considered my misfortune to be a just and well-deserved punishment for having abandoned myself to a Lais, after I had enjoyed the felicity of possessing a woman like Henrietta. My disease was not a case within the province of empirics, and I bethought myself of confiding in M. de la Haye, who was then dining with me every day, and made no mystery of his poverty. He placed me in the hands of a skilful surgeon, who was at the same time a dentist. He recognized certain symptoms which made it a necessity to sacrifice me to the god Mercury, and that treatment, owing to the season of the year, compelled me to keep my room for 6 weeks. It was during the winter of 1749. While I was thus curing myself of an ugly disease, De la Haye inoculated me with another as bad, or perhaps even worse, which I should never have thought myself susceptible of catching. This Fleming, who left me only for 1 hour in the morning to go, at least he said so, to church to perform his devotions, made a bigot of me, and to such an extent that I agreed with him that I was indeed fortunate to have caught a disease which was the origin of the faith now taking possession of my soul. I would thank God fervently and with the most complete conviction for having employed Mercury to lend my mind, until then wrapped in darkness, to the pure light of holy truth. There was no doubt that such an extraordinary change in my reasoning system was the result of the exhaustion brought on by the mercury. That impure and always injurious metal had weakened my mind to such an extent that I had become almost besotted, and I fancied that until then my judgment had been insane. The result was, in my newly acquired wisdom, I took the resolution of leading a totally different sort of life in the future. De la Haye would often cry for joy when he saw me shedding tears caused by the contrition which he had the wonderful cleverness to sow in my poor sickly soul. He would talk to me of paradise and the other world, just as if he visited them in person, and I never laughed at him. He had accustomed me to renounce my reason. Now, to renounce that divine faculty, a man must no longer be conscious of its value. He must have become an idiot. The reader may judge of the state to which I was reduced by the following specimen. One day De la Haye said to me, "It is not known whether God created the world during the vernal equinox or during the autumnal one." "Creation being granted," I replied, in spite of the mercury, "such a question is childish, for the seasons are relative, and differ in different quarters of the globe." De la Haye reproached me with the heathenism of my ideas, and told me I must abandon such impious reasonings, and I gave way. That man had been a Jesuit. He not only, however, refused to admit it, he would not even suffer anyone to mention it to him. This was how he completed his work of seduction, by telling me the history of his life. After I had been educated in a good school, he said, and had devoted myself with some success to the arts and sciences, I was for 20 years employed at the University of Paris. Afterwards I served as an engineer in the army, and since that time I have published several works anonymously, which are now in use in every boys' school. Having given up the military service, and being poor, I undertook and completed the education of several young men, some of whom now shine in the world even more by their excellent conduct than by their talents. My last pupil was Marquis Botta. Now, being without employment, I live, as you see, trusting in God's providence. 4 years ago I made the acquaintance of Baron Bavois, from Lausanne, the son of General Bavois, who commanded a regiment in the service of the Duke of Modena, and afterwards was unfortunate enough to make himself too conspicuous. The young baron, a Calvinist like his father, did not like the idle life he was leading at home, and he solicited me to undertake his education in order to fit him for a military career. Delighted at the opportunity of cultivating his fine natural disposition, I gave up everything to devote myself entirely to my task. I soon discovered that, in the question of faith, he knew himself to be in error, and that he remained a Calvinist only out of respect to his family. When I had found out his secret feelings on that head, I had no difficulty in proving to him that his most important interests were involved in that question, as his eternal salvation was at stake. Struck by the truth of my words, he abandoned himself to my affection, and I took him to Rome, where I presented him to the Pope, Benedict XIV, who, immediately after the abjuration of my pupil, got him a lieutenancy in the army of the Duke of Modena. But the dear proselyte, who was only 25 years of age, cannot live upon his pay of 7 sequins a month, and since his abjuration he has received nothing from his parents, who are highly incensed at what they call his apostasy. He would find himself compelled to go back to Lausanne if I did not assist him, but alas, I am poor and without employment, as I can only send him the trifling sums which I can obtain from the few good Christians with whom I am acquainted. My pupil, whose heart is full of gratitude, would be very glad to know his benefactors, but they refuse to acquaint him with their names, and they are right, because charity, in order to be meritorious, must not partake of any feeling of vanity. Thank God, I have no cause for such a feeling. But I am too happy to act as a father towards the young saint, and to have had a share, as the humble instrument of the Almighty, in the salvation of his soul. That handsome and good young man trusts no one but me, and writes to me regularly twice a week. I am too discreet to communicate his letters to you, but if you were to read them, they would make you weep for sympathy. It is to him that I have sent the 3 gold pieces which you gave me yesterday. As he said the last words, my converter rose, and went to the window to dry his tears. I felt deeply moved and full of admiration for the virtue of De la Haye and of his pupil, who, to save his soul, has placed himself under the hard necessity of accepting alms. I cried as well as the apostle, and, in my dawning piety, I told him that I insisted not only upon remaining unknown to his pupil, but also upon ignoring the amount of sums he might take out of my purse to forward to him, and I therefore begged that he would help himself without rendering me any account. De la Haye embraced me warmly, saying that, by following the precepts of the gospel so well, I should certainly win the kingdom of heaven. The mind is sure to follow the body. It is a privilege enjoyed by matter. With an empty stomach I became a fanatic, and the hollow made in my brain by the mercury became the home of enthusiasm. Without mentioning it to De la Haye, I wrote to my 3 friends, Messieurs Bragadin and company, several letters full of pathos concerning my Tartuffe and his pupil, and I managed to communicate my fanaticism to them. You are aware, dear reader, that nothing is so catching as the plague. Now, fanaticism, no matter of what nature, is the only plague of the human mind. I made my friends to understand that the good of our society depended upon the admission of these 2 virtuous individuals. I allowed them to guess it, but, having myself become a Jesuit, I took care not to say it openly. It would of course be better if such an idea appeared to have emanated from those men, so simple, and at the same time so truly virtuous. It is God's will, I wrote to them, for deceit must always take refuge under the protection of that sacred name, that you employ all your influence in Venice, and to find an honourable position for M. de la Haye, and to promote the interests of young M. Bavois in his profession. M. de Bragadin answered that De la Haye could take up his quarters with us in his palace, and that Bavois was to write to his protector, the Pope, entreating his Holiness to recommend him to the ambassador of Venice, who would then forward that recommendation to the Senate, and that Bavois could, in that way, feel sure of good employment. The affair of the Patriarchate of Aquileia was at that time under discussion. The Republic of Venice was in possession of it as well as the Emperor of Austria, who claimed the jus eligendi. The Pope Benedict XIV, who had been chosen as arbiter, and as he had not yet given his decision, it was evident that the Republic would show very great deference to his recommendation. While that important affair was enlisting all our sympathies, and while they were expecting in Venice a letter stating the effect of the Pope's recommendation, I was the hero of a comic adventure, which, for the sake of my readers, must not pass unnoticed. At the beginning of April 1st, I was entirely cured of my last misfortune. I had recovered all my usual vigour, and I accompanied my converter to church every day, never missing a sermon. We likewise spent the evening together at the cafe, where we generally met a great many officers. Among them was a Provencal, who amused everyone with his boasting and with the recital of the military exploits by which he pretended to have distinguished himself in the service of several countries, and principally in Spain. As he was truly a source of amusement, everybody pretended to believe him in order to keep up the game. One day, as I was staring at him, he asked me whether I knew him. "By George, sir," I exclaimed, "know you? Why, did we not fight side by side at the battle of Arbela?" At these words everybody burst out laughing, but the boaster, nothing daunted, said with animation, "Well, gentlemen, I do not see anything so very laughable in that. I was at that battle, and therefore this gentleman might very well have remarked me. In fact, I think I can recollect him." And continuing to speak with me, he named the regiment in which we were brother officers. Of course we embraced one another, congratulating each other upon the pleasure we both felt of meeting again in Parma. After that truly comic joke, I left the coffee room in the company of my inseparable preacher. The next morning, as I was at breakfast with De la Haye, the boasting Provencal entered my room without taking off his hat, and said, "Monsieur de Arbela, I have something of importance to tell you. Make haste and follow me. If you are afraid, you may take anyone you please with you. I am good for half a dozen men." I left my chair, seized my pistols, and aimed at him. "No one," I said with decision, "has the right to come and disturb me in my room. Be off this minute, or I will blow your brains out." The fellow, drawing his sword, dared me to murder him, but at the same moment De la Haye threw himself between us, stamping violently on the floor. The landlord came up and threatened the officer to send for the police if he did not withdraw immediately. He went away, saying that I had insulted him in public, and that he would take care that the reparation I owed him should be as public as the insult. When he had gone, seeing that the affair might take a tragic turn, I began to examine with De la Haye how it could be avoided, but we could not puzzle our imagination, for in less than half an hour an officer of the Infante of Parma presented himself, and requested me to repair immediately to headquarters, where M. de Bertolon, commander of Parma, wanted to speak with me. I asked De la Haye to accompany me as a witness of what I had said in the coffee room, as well as what may have taken place in the apartment. I presented myself before the commander, whom I found surrounded by several officers, among them the bragging Provencal. M. Bertolon, who was a witty man, smiled when he saw me. Then, with a very serious countenance, he said to me, "Sir, as you have made a laughing stock of this officer in a public place, it is but right that you should give him publicly the satisfaction which he claims, and as commander of this city, I find myself bound in duty to ask you for that satisfaction in order to settle the affair amicably." "Commander," I answered, "I do not see why a satisfaction should be offered to this gentleman, for it is not true that I have insulted him by turning him into ridicule. I told him that I had seen him at the battle of Arbela, and I could not have any doubt about it when he said he had been present at that battle, and that he knew me again." "Yes," interrupted the officer, "but I heard Rodela, not Arbela, and everyone knows that I fought at Rodela. But you said Arbela, and certainly with the intention of laughing at me, since that battle had been fought more than 2000 years ago. while the battle of Rodella in Africa took place in our time, and I was there under the orders of the Duke of Mortemar. In the first place, sir, you have no right to judge my intentions, but I do not dispute your having been present at Rodella, since you say so. But in that case the tables are turned, and I now demand a reparation from you if you dare discredit my having been at Arbela. I certainly did not serve under the Duke de Mortemar, because he was not there, at least to my knowledge, but I was aide-de-camp of Parmenion, and I was wounded under his eyes. If you were to ask me to show you the scar, I could not satisfy you, for you must understand that the body I had at that time does not exist any longer, and in my present body envelope I am only 23 years old. All this seems sheer madness, but at all events I have witnesses to prove that you have been laughing at me, for you stated that you had seen me at that battle, and by the powers, it is not possible, because I was not there. At all events I demand satisfaction. So do I, and we have equal rights, if mine are not even better than yours, for your witnesses are likewise mine, and these gentlemen will assert that you said you had seen me at Rodella, and by the powers it is not possible, for I was not there. Well, I may have made a mistake. So may I, and therefore we have no longer any claim against one another. The commander, who had been biting his lips to restrain his mirth, said to him, "My dear sir, I do not see that you have the slightest right to demand satisfaction, since this gentleman confesses, like you, that he might have been mistaken." "But," remarked the officer, "is it credible that he was at the battle of Arbela?" "This gentleman leaves you free to believe or not to believe, and he is at liberty to assert that he was there until you can prove the contrary. Do you wish to deny it to make him draw his sword?" "God forbid! I would rather consider the affair ended." "Well, gentlemen," said the commander, "I have but one more duty to perform, and it is to advise you to embrace one another like two honest men." We followed the advice with the greatest pleasure. The next day the Provencal, rather crestfallen, came to share my dinner, and I gave him a friendly welcome. Thus was ended that comic adventure, to the great satisfaction of M. de la Haye. Chapter 4